My name's Jonah Hale, and I maintain the lighthouses on Black Reef Island, or what's left of them. There are 3 towers in total. North Point, the oldest one, the shorter South Tower, built after the war, and the half-sunken East Beacon, which no one talks about unless they've had too much rum. My assignment was supposed to last 6 weeks, a simple maintenance rotation. Oil the lamps, clean the lenses, test the radio beacons, file the nightly logs. Straightforward work. At least, that's what the Coastal Operations Manual said. I arrived just after dawn, ferried over by a one-man skiff whose pilot barely spoke. The sea was rough thick with kelp and the reek of engine oil, and when the island finally appeared through the fog, it looked more like a carcass than land. Black cliffs, slick with rain. The towers rose out of the rock like bones driven into the coast. The main quarters sat behind the central lighthouse. 2 prefab metal huts bolted to the stone. Inside, everything smelled like salt and wet copper. My orientation was handled by a man named Soren, who looked like he'd been here since the sea learned to whisper. He handed me a ring of keys, a weathered clipboard, and the thick gray manual every tech gets maintenance procedures. Black Reef Region, Reverend, 1997. Follow the log, he said, voice gravel low. Don't improvise. Don't overstay in the North Tower after midnight. I thought he was joking, but his expression didn't move. He just tapped a chipped fingernail on the manual. The rules keep the light steady, he added, and left before I could ask what that meant. The first thing you learn working coastal maintenance is routine. Routine keeps your head clear. You check the tide readings, the power levels, the oil reservoirs, the lens polish, the radio calibration, the foghorn relay. Every task has a form, a time, and a signature. My first inspection was at the South Tower, the most stable structure. I logged the readings by habit. Fuel gauge, 78%. Lens rotation, smooth, 12 RPM. Lamp ignition, functional. Nothing unusual. I liked the predictability. From there, I moved to North Point, the one Soren had warned me about. The climb up its iron staircase felt longer than it should have been. Each step rang like a dull bell, echoing upward into the hollow spine of the tower. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, until the scent of rust and sea brine overpowered everything else. The maintenance hatch stuck halfway, and I had to shoulder it open. When it finally gave, the lantern room greeted me with its usual chaos-smudged glass, grit on the lens, and that constant metallic hum from the wind slipping through the cracks. I opened the logbook, a leather-bound thing older than me. Pages fluttered in the damp breeze. Each entry followed the same format: time, weather, lens status, flame quality, initials. Nothing strange until the last entry. It wasn't typed or neatly written like the others. It was scrawled in pencil, shaky but deliberate. Never light the north lamp after midnight. That line wasn't in the manual. At first, I assumed it was an old superstition, some leftover note from a jittery keeper decades ago. I marked it with my pen to remind myself to report it later. The rest of the entry was normal. Lamp serviced, wick replaced, fuel topped. Esuichi Soren's initials. Outside, the fog thickened fast. I could hear the sea slapping the rocks below, irregular and heavy. I checked the time, 11:42 p.m. The light should have been dimming for the night cycle, but the reflection off the glass looked too bright. When I climbed up to the lamp itself, I froze. The lantern was already burning. I hadn't lit it, and according to the previous log, no one should have touched it since Soren's shift ended hours ago. The flame danced slow and steady inside the lens, even though the wick lever was locked in the off position. I checked the fuel reservoir bone dry. The heat coming off it was real though, a steady pulse against my face. The rule in the log suddenly didn't feel like a joke. I hesitated, staring at that impossible flame. My training said one thing: document the anomaly. Don't interact, but the part of me raised on old seafaring tales said another. I grabbed the extinguisher lever and gave it a pull. The light went out. The chamber fell into instant darkness. For a second, all I could hear was my own breath, ragged in the echoing metal room. Then, in the glass of the great Fresnel lens, I saw it movement. Not a reflection of me, not the sea, something else. It was faint, but unmistakable, a silhouette, standing in the spiral stairwell behind me. Too still to be human, too sharp to be a shadow. When I turned, there was nothing there but the dark curve of the steps. I switched on my inspection flashlight. The beam caught dust motes and old salt stains. The stairwell was empty. I swept the light again, slower this time, and realized something unsettling. The pattern of dust on the floor showed two sets of footprints. One set mine, fresh and muddy. The other, older, starting halfway up the stairs and ending right beside me. I knelt and touched the mark. The stone was wet, as if seawater had dripped there seconds ago. The radio on my belt hissed. I turned down the volume, but the static grew sharper, rhythmic, like breathing. A burst of distortion came through, and beneath it I heard a whisper, faint, a single word, "Keeper." The voice sounded exactly like mine. I shut off the radio. The tower fell silent again, except for the slow tapping of rain on glass. I backed down the stairs, one hand tight on the railing, and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it. Long shifts, isolation, exhaustion, it happens. The mind fills empty space with echoes. But when I reached the bottom door, I found the latch already drawn open. I was certain I'd locked it behind me. Outside, the fog had thickened into a solid wall. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The beam from the south tower still cut through the mist, steady and white, a comfort, almost. I started down the path toward the main quarters, but halfway there I stopped. The north lamp, the one I'd just extinguished, flared to life behind me. A deep amber glow bled through the fog, flickering against the rocks. The flame's reflection shimmered on the wet path like molten glass. I stood there, heart hammering, staring back at the tower. No wind, no sound, just that steady, defiant light, burning where it shouldn't. I turned to go, and caught a final glimpse through the fog, not the tower itself, but something moving inside the lantern room. A dark figure pacing in slow, deliberate steps, each one matching the rhythm of the sea below. When I blinked, the light went out again. I didn't sleep that night. The wind scraped across the window screens, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like someone walking above me. I kept thinking about the log entry, "Never light the north lamp after midnight." The words looped through my mind until I realized something that made my stomach turn. The ink in that note wasn't pencil. It was fresh charcoal, smudged across the page like it had been written only hours before I arrived. And in the margin beneath it, faint but visible, another line had appeared since I first opened the book. "If it lights itself, do not look into the glass." I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of the foghorn, distant, slow, like something breathing through steel lungs. I kept telling myself it was just wind through the cliffs, but deep down, it felt timed, almost deliberate. By dawn, the mist had thinned, revealing the jagged silhouette of the main lighthouse, the biggest of the three, sitting dead center on the island's ridge. Its light flickered once, weak and uncertain, then steadied as the generator kicked in. That was my next stop. The logbook said I needed to inspect the main beacon before noon, but I'd already learned that here, instructions weren't just about maintenance, they were about survival. So, after a cup of burnt coffee and a moment of hesitation at the door, I packed my toolkit, slung the spare oil can over my shoulder, and started toward the ridge trail. The fog closed behind me like a curtain. I woke before dawn, though I wasn't sure I'd slept at all. The sea outside was calm for once, but the air in my quarters tasted heavy, like the room itself had been breathing all night. My mind kept looping back to the flame I'd extinguished, and the rule that hadn't been there the day before. Work always helps quiet things down, so I went through the motions. Coffee from a dented thermos, checked the weather gauge outside the hut, logged the wind at 9 knots west-northwest, humidity near 80. Procedure keeps the brain anchored. When I reached the supply shed to sign out the day's tools, the manual caught my eye. It sat on the counter, spine up, pages warped by the damp. I remembered leaving it in the North Tower after my shift, on the same desk as the logbook, yet here it was, dry as bone. I should have been relieved, but something about it felt wrong. Lighter, somehow, as if it had fewer pages than before. I carried it to the workbench and thumbed through. The first section, fuel management, looked normal. Lamp oil ratios, cleaning solvent recipes, and refraction tables dated 1997. The next section should have been optical maintenance, but the numbering jumped from 4.2 straight to 7.1. Dozens of pages were missing. Torn clean, not worn or fallen. The remaining ones had small, dark stains along the edge, like fingerprints pressed into soot. Between 2 surviving pages lay a folded sheet that didn't belong. Different paper stock, older, yellowed, and written by hand in thick, black pencil. The glass holds what it sees. Clean with salt water only. Strike the 4th strike at dusk, never dawn. I stared at it, confused. Strike the 4th strike meant nothing to me. There are no strikes in lighthouse maintenance. Only rotations, beams, and intervals. I set it aside to ask Soren later, though I already suspected the answer would be silence. The rest of the manual was stranger still. Paragraphs had been crossed out in thin red ink and replaced with new sentences written in the margins. The handwriting varied, some blocky, some elegant, one so small it seemed meant for the paper fibers themselves. On the page labeled Radio Beacon Calibration, the printed instruction read, "Confirm frequency stability at 12 kHz 0.01 tolerance," but scrawled underneath in the same black pencil as the note was, "The signal must never hold silence longer than 13 seconds." I flipped ahead, scanning. The warnings grew more erratic, more like prayers than maintenance notes. "Do not whistle near the buoy. If the beam stops mid-turn, speak your name backwards until it moves. The sea does not forget miscounts." I'd spent 5 years in coastal operations, seen my share of oddball crews, but nothing like this. Someone had treated the manual like scripture, adding verses of their own. At 0700, I radioed the main relay station for my daily check-in. Static replied. Not unusual. The island's position made signal work spotty. I logged intermittent interference and moved on. That morning's task was lens inspection at South Tower. The weather held clear enough for sunlight to break through the fog. Rare luxury here. Inside the tower, everything looked ordinary. Neat gear sets, clean burn cup, steady rotation. The familiarity steadied me. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the handwritten notes. Clean with salt water, only. That line repeated in my mind. The manuals always recommended distilled water to avoid mineral residue. Using salt water made no sense. Salt corrodes, it doesn't cleanse. But curiosity gets the better of techs. We test. I decided to see what would happen. I filled a rag with seawater from the nearby drum and wiped one of the smaller glass panels. Instantly, the smell changed. Ozone and iron, like lightning on wet metal. The cloth hissed softly. I pulled back, startled. The spot I'd cleaned glowed faintly against the sunlight, forming a blurred shape, almost like a reflection trapped behind the glass. I leaned closer. The glow shifted. resolved into faint writing beneath the surface of the pane. I could only make out a few words before it faded. Keep them turned away. Then it vanished, leaving only the streak of salt behind. I rinsed the cloth, pretending I'd imagined it. The rest of the lens panels cleaned normally. No glow, no words. Still, that first one kept drawing my eye as I finished the inspection. I marked the event in my log. Possible optical anomaly, temporary luminescence during cleaning. Official, impersonal, believable. That's how we hide the things that shouldn't be written down. When I returned to the quarters, Soren was gone. His bed neatly made, radio missing, logbook taken. Only a cup of half-drunk tea remained on the table, cold and skinning over. The schedule board still listed him on duty through Friday, but there was no sign of him anywhere on the island paths. I decided to reread the manual front to back, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the mess he'd left. Midway through, tucked between two diagrams of lens housing, I found another loose sheet, this one written in blue ink, almost neat. In absence of supervision, continue routine. Do not alter the frequency sequence. Remember the 13-second rule. At the bottom, in small letters, S.H. I read that signature 3 times. Soren Holm. The same initials from the midnight logbook. I folded the paper into my pocket. Every line I read seemed to draw me deeper into a system of procedures that didn't exist anywhere in the company archives. It was as if the island had written its own maintenance plan, using human hands when it needed them. By late afternoon, fog returned. I carried the manual outside to check one last thing: the serial number stamped on its spine. Most field manuals have a code showing when they were printed. This one read BR19C001. I called the mainland operations office to verify, using the emergency sat line. The clerk on duty paused for a long time before answering. "Sir, that number doesn't match any issue we've ever released. Are you sure you're reading it correctly?" I read it again. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Those codes haven't been used since 1972. Before automation, the line cut out with a pop of static. The receiver speaker let out one long sigh of white noise, then silence. That night, I tried to focus on routine reports, but the numbers kept changing. Tide levels, barometric pressure, rotation speed, tiny deviations that made no sense. Each time I corrected the entry, the gauge would shift again, as if reacting to my pen. By the 5th attempt, I gave up and wrote them in pencil instead. The room felt colder than it should have. I could hear the North Tower's lamp turning, though it wasn't scheduled to light. The motor's faint grind carried through the wind like slow breathing. I told myself it was just inertia, the mechanism free-spinning after last night's inspection. But the rhythm was too steady. I poured another cup of coffee and opened the manual again. The page I'd left marked earlier was different. Whole lines of type had rearranged themselves. Where it once read, "Inspect lamp every 6 hours," it now read, "Inspect lamp when it calls for you." I ran my finger along the print. The ink was warm. Outside, the foghorn sounded once, then again, though it hadn't worked for months. A third blast followed, lower, almost human. The manual's paper trembled beneath my fingertips, faint vibrations moving in time with the horn. I closed the book gently, set it on the table, and watched the steam curl from my cup until it died away. The night smelled of salt and rust, and somewhere beyond the window, the sea whispered, as if repeating my name. I didn't mark the time, or the weather, or the temperature that night. I just wrote one line in the daily log: "Manual modified, pending clarification." Then I slid the pencil behind my ear, took the lantern from its hook, and stepped into the fog to check the North Tower again. Because if the book wanted to change itself, I needed to see what else had started to rewrite. The fog never really leaves Black Reef Island. Even when the sun burns through the clouds, It hangs low over the cliffs like a ghost that doesn't know it's dead yet. That morning, I could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the air felt thick, almost wet to breathe. My radio crackled once in my jacket pocket, then went silent again. The path to the East Lighthouse wound through marsh and broken rock. Each step sank slightly, the mud sucking at my boots, leaving behind shallow prints that filled with brackish water. The main beacon's mechanical hum still carried faintly through the mist behind me, steady, rhythmic, but the farther I walked, the more it was swallowed by the sound of waves smashing against stone. According to the map in the logbook, there used to be a small maintenance shed near the midpoint of the trail. It wasn't marked as active, just penciled in, faintly, almost an afterthought. I figured it was worth checking, maybe to stash tools or grab dry rags. When I reached it, though, it didn't look abandoned. The door was half open. A lantern burned weakly inside, and the smell of diesel hung heavy in the air. There were boot prints in the mud outside large ones, maybe size 11 or 12, and they weren't mine. For a second, I thought maybe one of the old keepers had come back. Maybe the board hadn't told me everything. But when I called out, "Hello? Maintenance crew?" there was no answer, only the creak of the door in the wind. Inside, the shed was cramped, just a single narrow room lined with shelves of rusted tools and oil drums. A mug sat on the workbench, half full of cold coffee, fresh. Someone had been here recently. And then I noticed the wall covered in papers, torn out pages, hand-drawn sketches of the island, some showing all 3 lighthouses connected by lines. Others had words scrawled over them in thick pencil. "Never look at the mirror light. It watches when the horn stops. The keeper always returns before dawn." I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Then, from somewhere outside, came the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. I could see a faint shadow through the fog, tall, broad shoulders, a heavy coat. My first instinct was to step forward, to explain I was authorized maintenance, but something in my gut told me not to. The figure lingered a moment, then turned away and vanished into the mist. No sound of retreating steps, no splash in the marsh, just gone like it had dissolved back into the fog itself. I waited another full minute before stepping outside. Nothing, only silence and that heavy air that makes you feel like you're standing underwater. I decided to keep moving toward the east tower. The trail dipped down near the shore, where sharp rocks jutted out of the sea like teeth. Gulls screamed somewhere above, though I couldn't see them. I kept thinking about those notes in the shed. The keeper always returns before dawn. Was that some kind of island superstition, or an old crew member's joke that got out of hand? I reached the base of the East Lighthouse around 11:40 a.m. The place was smaller than the main one, 3 stories at most, but in worse shape. Moss climbed up the walls, and one of the railings had come loose, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of rust and seaweed. The generator room sat below ground level, down a short iron staircase slick with moisture. I set my lantern on the landing and climbed down. The hum of the machinery was weaker here, uneven. I found the control panel old analog switches, worn labels, and checked the fuel gauge. Barely above 0. I was about to refill it when the radio in my jacket hissed to life again. A voice, faint, static-filled. "Halt! Do not!" Then silence. I stared at it. My name. That was my name. I tried responding, but the radio only gave back static. Then, from somewhere above me, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps again. Slow, heavy, circling the upper floor. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. I climbed back up, one hand on the railing, and as I reached the main level, the lantern light flickered. The air felt colder. I looked around. The door was still shut, but something felt occupied, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then I saw it. Near the far corner, where a patch of the floorboards had warped from dampness, stood a pair of boots, black, scuffed, the kind worn by maintenance workers. But they weren't empty. There were legs in them, leading up to a long, dark coat and the outline of a man's face obscured by shadow. He was just standing there, facing the wall. "Sir," I said quietly, "are you with the board?" The man didn't turn, didn't move, and then slowly he raised one hand, as if to point toward the staircase behind me. I turned instinctively, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, he was gone. The only thing left was the faint sound of boots echoing up the stairs and the open door that hadn't been opened before. I didn't chase, I just stood there, gripping the lantern handle until my knuckles went white. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might shake the glass. I refilled the generator and made a note in the logbook: East Lighthouse repaired fuel line. But I also added something else under my breath, almost out of superstition. Do not enter if the keeper is present. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, the kind that turns every light into a smudge and makes your own reflection in the window look like someone else staring back. The radio stayed silent, the sea restless. But sometime after midnight, as I checked the logbook again, I noticed a new note scrawled on the bottom line in handwriting that wasn't mine. If the mirror light flashes, do not look. And outside, somewhere across the island, a single beam blinked twice through the fog, like a signal meant for me alone. The beam blinked twice, then again, slower, like someone was sending a message through the fog. I stood at the window, half expecting it to be some trick of reflection. But no, the light came from the North Ridge, where no active beacon should have been. According to the map, the third lighthouse, the North Tower, had been decommissioned over a decade ago. The board had called it unstable. Still, that faint flash came again. 2 short bursts. Pause. 1 long. I'd done enough maritime work to recognize signaling patterns, but this one wasn't in any handbook I knew. Morse? Maybe. But if so, it didn't make sense. It almost felt personal, like something testing whether I'd look back. I remembered the note scrawled in the logbook. If the mirror light flashes, do not look. That should have been warning enough. But curiosity is its own kind of disease. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and the cold hit me like a slap. The fog had a metallic smell that night, sharp, like iron and salt mixed together. My boots scraped against the boardwalk as I made my way toward the equipment shed. But every sound came back wrong, stretched out and echoed, as if the island itself were listening. Halfway there, I heard something else, the sound of a lens turning. You know that subtle click and whir when a beacon's glass rotates? That steady rhythm that never stops once the light's active? I heard that. Only the East Lighthouse, the one I'd just fixed, wasn't supposed to rotate automatically yet. I turned toward it and saw nothing through the fog. Only that dull red glow pulsing faintly at the top, like a heartbeat. The radio in my jacket crackled again. Static, then a whisper, soft, drawn out, almost melodic. "Don't look." I froze. I didn't reply. The last time I'd answered, I'd heard my own name whispered back. Instead, I switched the radio off and kept moving. The North Ridge Trail was barely visible, an uneven path lined with seagrass that swayed even without wind. At times, the fog was so dense that my own flashlight beam seemed to stop 3 feet in front of me. I had to follow the sound of the ocean waves pounding against the rocks to orient myself. Then I reached a clearing where the fog thinned just enough to see it. The North Lighthouse, tall, blackened, half-eaten by rust and sea salt. Its windows were shattered, and part of the outer railing hung loose like broken ribs. But at the top, the lens still gleamed faintly, a single beam turning in slow, uneven circles. And every time it passed, I could feel warmth on my face, not from the light itself, but from the direction it came, like it wasn't shining outward, but inward. I climbed the steps one by one, the metal groaning beneath my weight. The door at the base was half rotted, but unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of oil and mildew. I could hear the faint hum of machinery somewhere above, though the place clearly hadn't been powered in years. On the wall near the staircase was another logbook, this one water-damaged and nearly unreadable. Only a few lines remained legible. July 17th, mirror installed. July 22nd, do not face it during rotation. August 3rd, keeper missing. That word again, keeper. I ran my finger down the page and felt something sticky old oil, or maybe blood, and wiped it on my sleeve. Then, as I turned toward the stairwell, my flashlight flickered. For a split second, the beam caught movement near the upper landing. Someone, or something, standing just out of view, hand resting on the railing. The figure moved away before I could focus. I started up the stairs, one step at a time, every creak sounding louder than the last. The higher I climbed, the more that humming sound deepened, a low, rhythmic vibration that you could feel through the walls. By the time I reached the top, it wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a pulse. The lantern room was circular, lined with mirrors angled toward the central lens. The mechanism still rotated, though slowly the light reflected off the mirrors, bouncing around the room in strange geometric patterns that made it hard to tell where anything truly was. I moved closer, watching my own reflection stretch and twist in the glass, my face elongating, splitting, reforming like smoke. And then one of the reflections blinked, but I didn't. My breath hitched. The mirrored version of me smiled faintly, tilting its head as if studying something behind me. I spun around, nothing, only the turning beam. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. Just an empty patch of glass, faintly fogged from the inside. The generator sputtered then, the rotation slowing. The light began to stutter. Flash, pause, flash, flash, and with each flicker, the room seemed smaller. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. Then I saw movement again, not in the glass this time, but behind it. A hand, pale and wet, sliding down the inside of the mirror, as if something were trapped behind it. The fingertips left faint trails of condensation that spelled something 4 letters before vanishing. Help. I stepped back, tripping on a metal rung. My flashlight clattered to the floor and went out. For a few seconds, I was in total darkness, except for that faint, stuttering light. And in that brief silence between flashes, I heard it breathing, slow, shallow, but close enough that I could feel it on the back of my neck. When I turned the light back on, the mirror was cracked down the middle. The reflection warped and doubled. I didn't stay to see more. I ran down the stairs, nearly slipping twice, until I burst through the door into the fog again. The air outside felt almost alive, thick, pulsing in rhythm with the distant hum of the main beacon. As I made my way back to the cabin, I realized my reflection followed me in every window I passed, not delayed, not reversed, just slightly out of sync, like it had learned how to move on its own. By the time I reached the cabin, dawn was just beginning to seep through the mist, dull and gray. I thought maybe things would quiet down once the light returned. But then, from somewhere far out at sea, came the sound of the foghorn, long, low, and wrong. It wasn't the steady tone I'd heard before. It sounded closer, and this time, it didn't stop. By mid-morning, the fog had finally begun to thin, leaving the island cold, damp, and gray. The sea, restless the night before, now boiled gently against the jagged rocks, each wave sending up a fine spray that settled like powder over my boots. I thought I'd find some respite, some rational explanation for the events at the North Lighthouse. But the island had other plans. The horn began just as I stepped outside to inspect the main generator. Long, low, and deliberate, a tone so deep it vibrated through my chest and set my teeth on edge. I froze. It wasn't the usual automated foghorn. That one had a mechanical rhythm, predictable and safe. This had a cadence that felt alive. Slow pulse, pause, 2 shorter blasts. Then a long, drawn-out wail that carried across the cliffs and over the water like a summons. I ran my hand over the manual, the salt-stained, rewritten version that seemed to rearrange itself on its own. Nothing mentioned this. Not a word about a horn that could call someone or something. I pulled on my jacket and headed toward the cliffside to trace the sound. The path was narrow, slick with sea spray and moss. Each step made a soft squelch as water seeped into my boots. The fog hung low, swirling at ankle level, occasionally drifting up to obscure the trail entirely. The horn wasn't coming from the main lighthouse. Not from the north, not the east. It came from the rocks below the cliffs, where no one was supposed to go. The slope was treacherous. Sharp stones jutted like the teeth of some sea beast, moss covering them in deceptive patches. I climbed slowly, every footfall measured, every sense straining. The horn's call seemed to guide me, pulling me toward a jagged outcrop that jutted into the waves. And then I saw it, a small stone-built platform, long abandoned, half submerged by rising tide. On it sat a horn, massive and blackened with rust, unlike any I'd seen in standard operations. Its mouthpiece faced the water, but the vibrations carried inland, through the cliff and into the fog, as if the horn were listening and responding. I crouched beside it. The metal was warm, strangely warm, like it had just been handled. My hand trembled as I traced the rim, feeling the vibrations thrum through my fingertips. And then I heard it clearly. A voice, low, guttural, speaking from the horn itself, carried with the vibrations, words almost incomprehensible. "It come, follow, light, keeper." I jerked my hand back. The sound wasn't mechanical, not air, not steam. It was alive, a pulse of intent, trying to coax me toward the cliff edge. I realized then that the horn wasn't warning me. It was summoning me. I stepped back, slipping slightly on wet stone. The tide had risen closer to the platform than it should have, and a wave licked my ankle. The voice repeated, slower this time, more deliberate. "Do not resist. Keeper waits." I turned toward the fog and caught sight of movement of shadowy figures stepping lightly across the rocks. Not human, not fully. Their outlines were vague, blurred by the mist, but tall, thin, and hunched in impossible angles. They moved toward the horn, but not in the path I'd just taken. Their passage made no sound, yet the horn seemed to pulse faster with each step. Panic shot through me. I stumbled backward, gripping a jagged rock for support, but the vibration in the horn shifted. The sound wrapped around me, sank into my chest. My heart raced, but something deeper instinctive told me to obey. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge, and the horn sound warped, rising in pitch, almost shrieking. Then, suddenly, silence. The figures had vanished. The horn sat inert, no vibrations, no sound. Only the faint hiss of the sea against the rocks and my own ragged breathing. I ran back toward the cabin, mud sucking at my boots, slipping once but keeping forward. My thoughts swirled. The horn calls, the keeper waits. I made it inside, shaking, drenched with seawater and sweat. I leaned against the door frame, catching my breath. For the first time, I considered the possibility that Black Reef Island had its own rules, independent of any manual, of any protocol, of any human authority. And then I remembered the other warnings. Do not look into the glass. The keeper always returns before dawn. If the mirror light flashes, do not look. The horn's call wasn't just a warning. It was a test, and I had already failed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the low hum of the horn, distant but persistent, vibrating through the floorboards like a pulse, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. By the next morning, the fog had thickened again. The air was still, the sea unusually quiet, but the horn's pulse remained faintly in my chest, as though the island itself had left a memory imprint on me. When I stepped outside to continue my inspections, I saw footprints leading from the horn platform straight toward the cabin, though no one had passed that way. And in the distance, moving silently along the cliff edge, I saw a figure, tall, dark, impossibly still, the first keeper. The fog had been relentless that morning, curling around the cabin like fingers reaching for me. I could barely see beyond the edge of the boardwalk. Every step I took felt slower than it should, as if the island were resisting my movement. The footprints from the horn platform didn't stop at the cabin. They ended just short of my door. Then, nothing. No continuation, no indication of where they led. Yet I knew someone, or something, had been there. Something that could step without leaving a trace. I tried to focus on routine maintenance, pretending the events of the last 2 days were just anomalies. I checked the main lighthouse's oil levels, verified rotation speeds, and logged everything. The motion of work steadied me, or at least it should have. But the air was thick with anticipation, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Then I saw it, a figure on the ridge, not moving like a human, tall, angular, wrapped in what looked like a dark coat or cloak that merged with the fog. It didn't walk. It glided silently over the uneven cliffside rocks. I froze. The figure stopped suddenly and seemed to study me. I knew immediately. This was the keeper. I had never believed in the stories older crews whispered the tales of the mysterious figure who maintained the lighthouses when no one else could, who appeared out of nowhere and vanished without a trace. But now, standing there in the cold morning fog, I knew they were real. The keeper lifted a hand, long, pale, almost skeletal, and pointed toward the east lighthouse. My gut twisted. The message was clear: follow or face consequences I couldn't imagine. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and moved carefully, my boots crunching in the gravel. Each step echoed louder than it should have, though the fog swallowed all other sound. As I approached the tower, the keeper was already inside, standing at the base of the stairs. I hesitated, hand on the railing, its head tilted slightly, observing me. Not threatening, just watching. I climbed the stairs, trying to keep my breathing even. When I reached the lantern room, the keeper had vanished. Only the lens rotated, slower than normal, reflecting the dim morning light in strange, fractured patterns across the walls. Then I noticed the mirror, the central pane, which had shown my warped reflection before, was now clear. But as I leaned in, I caught movement, a shadow sliding across the back of the glass, out of sync with the lens rotation. The figure of the keeper materialized behind the glass, though the room had no space for it to be. I stumbled back, tripping over the railing. The keeper's reflection didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, staring at me with hollow, black eyes. And then it spoke not with words, but with a vibration that I felt in my chest. I didn't hear it. I felt it. Balance the lights, follow the rules, maintain the cycle. I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. The rules, the strange protocols, everything I had ignored, everything I had questioned. The keeper had enforced them, and now I was part of the system, whether I wanted to be or not. By the time I regained my footing, the figure was gone. The room was empty, quiet, except for the slow rotation of the lens. The air smelled faintly of salt and burned metal. My hand shook. I knew I had seen the keeper, and I knew it had been watching me the entire time I worked on the island. Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly. The sea beyond glimmered under the weak sunlight. but the sense of being watched lingered. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. The manual, the mirror, the horn, the keeper. It was all connected, a cycle I didn't yet fully understand. I sat at the table and wrote in the logbook. Keeper observed. Instructions unclear. Must continue routine. Even as I wrote it, I could feel the pulse of the island, steady and insistent, calling me toward the lighthouses. The rules were not suggestions. They were commands. And I was running out of time. That night, the fog returned, thick and suffocating. Every lighthouse light on the island blinked independently, some faster, some slower. Their beams crisscrossed the cliffs and cliffsides, bouncing off mirrors and glass panes, creating a maze of light and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, the horn sounded not one long call this time, but a series of irregular blasts echoing across the island like footsteps. I knew the keeper had set the night in motion, and I knew I had to follow. It was coming closer. The fog didn't just roll in that evening, it swallowed the island whole, thick, impenetrable, and heavy enough that every step felt like wading through water. I stood on the boardwalk outside the cabin, flashlight in hand, watching the 3 lighthouses flare to life one by one. It was wrong. All 3 were active, but their rotations were out of sync. The main beacon pulsed in short bursts. The east light swung lazily, almost sluggish, and the north mirror light that cursed North Tower fractured the fog with a chaotic pattern of reflections. Shadows leapt and merged in ways that made my stomach turn. The horn called once, low and mournful, sending a vibration through the wooden floorboards that made me stumble. I gripped the railing for support, my boots wet from the mist and mud, heart hammering. Each beam of light cut through the fog like fingers, searching, probing, testing. I knew instinctively what I had to do, maintain the cycle. Climbing first to the east lighthouse, I checked the fuel lines, ensuring the generator stayed steady. Mirrors reflected the moonlight in erratic bursts, like flashes of warning. Every adjustment I made caused subtle shifts in the beams, almost like the island itself was reacting to me, correcting me if I was wrong. Next, I headed to the main tower. The wind howled through broken shutters and around jagged rocks, carrying with it the faint metallic echo of the horn. I climbed the spiral staircase, counting each step to steady my nerves. At the top, the lens rotated perfectly, but the light threw shadows into the fog in impossible pattern shapes that looked vaguely humanoid, moving across cliffs and water alike. And then I heard its footsteps high above the stairwell, soft but deliberate. I froze. Not the keeper this time. Something else. Something faster. Closer. I could feel it circling, waiting. I ignored it, focused on the controls. Every switch, every dial, every valve adjustment mattered. The lights had to maintain a balance, a rhythm. One misstep, and I wasn't entirely sure what would happen, but I knew the keeper's warning about rules was absolute. By the time I returned to the cabin, soaked with condensation and sea spray, the North Tower's mirror light was pulsing faster. The reflections fractured, multiplied, filling the fog with disorienting patterns. I stumbled across the rocks to get closer, careful, measured, listening to the horn's irregular calls, and finally realized that the beams weren't just illuminating the fog, they were signaling each other. I watched as the 3 beams intersected over the cliffs and sea, forming a lattice of light. Each intersection glowed faintly red before fading, like the pulse of a heart. And from the lattice, shapes began to emerge, fleeting, shadowy forms, thin and impossibly tall, moving with the rhythm of the lights. The keeper was among them. I could see the tall, angular form emerging from the north beam, stretching across the fog, guiding the shadows with subtle gestures. My chest tightened. The cycle was happening, the beams, the horn, the keeper, all in motion. I felt a pull, like the island itself was urging me to participate. I wasn't a spectator anymore. I was part of the system. As the night deepened, time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. I moved from lighthouse to lighthouse, checking, adjusting, following the strange rhythm. Every time I thought I had a moment of rest, the horn's low call reminded me that the night was endless. Then, from the North Tower's mirror lens, I caught a reflection that made me stop cold. My own reflection, yes, but it wasn't mirroring me. It was ahead of me, moving, independent, and behind it, the shadow of the keeper, stretching long, merging with the lattice of beams. My reflection tilted its head, smiled faintly, and raised a hand toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the fog. The horn cried again, a sharp, jagged sound that split the night, and the reflections twisted violently, overlapping, merging, multiplying. I realized then the truth. The night wasn't endless by chance. It was endless because the island, the lighthouses, the horn, and the keeper were all part of the same cycle, one that could never stop, one that demanded constant maintenance, one that demanded me. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the cliffs, I was exhausted. My hands were raw from handling the controls, my lungs burned from the damp air, and my mind felt stretched thin. The beams synchronized at last, settling into a steady rhythm. The horn's vibration faded, leaving only the faint pulse of the sea. I looked toward the North Tower. The keeper had vanished, leaving the lens empty. The lattice of light lingered in the fog, fading gradually, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of control, and only a sliver. I knew the night would return. The horn would call again, the reflections would move, and I would be ready, or at least I hoped I would be. As dawn broke fully over Black Reef Island, the fog began to lift, leaving the lighthouses standing stark against the pale sky. The island was quiet, almost too quiet, but in the distance, far beyond the cliffs, I could see the faintest flicker of the North Tower's mirror lens, like a heartbeat pulsing through the fog. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew the cycle wasn't over. Not yet. The sun rose weakly over Black Reef Island, pale light struggling to break through the lingering fog. The cliffs, the rocks, the jagged shoreline, they all seemed smaller, quieter, almost like the island itself was holding its breath. But I knew better. I knew that the night had left a pulse in the air, a subtle vibration that hummed through the boards beneath my feet, through the walls of the cabin, through me. I had learned the rhythm of the lights, the timing of the horn, the cadence of the keeper's movements. Each task, each procedure, each precaution mattered. Miss one step and the balance would collapse. The reflections, the beams, the fog, they would become chaotic, dangerous, unforgiving. That morning, I began my rounds like any other, the main lighthouse first. The generator hummed, steady, obedient. The east beacon's mirrors reflected cleanly now, aligned perfectly to the main lens. The North Tower remained dormant, yet I could feel its pulse, faint but insistent, deep in the fog. I approached the North Tower last. The path was slick, and the cliffs beneath seemed more treacherous than ever. My flashlight illuminated the mist, throwing long dancing shadows across the rocks. I stepped carefully, listening to the faint hum of the sea, the distant cry of gulls, the subtle vibration in my chest, the echo of the horn that would not sound for hours. The north lighthouse door was closed, but unlocked. I entered cautiously, the smell of rust and mildew immediately filling my nostrils. The lens rotated slowly, reflecting the early morning light in fractured patterns across the lantern room walls. I checked the mirrors, all aligned, all clear. The pulse of the island seemed to synchronize with my movements. And then I saw it, the keeper. Not a shadow, not a reflection. Standing there, at the far end of the lantern room, watching me with those hollow black eyes. Tall, angular, impossibly still. The long coat merged with the darkness, the fog, the light itself. My chest tightened. I didn't feel fear, not exactly. Fear had long ago been replaced by awareness, by understanding that the Keeper was not here to threaten me. It was here to enforce. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed toward the center of the room. I moved forward, following the gesture, and noticed the central mirror lens. Its glass was clear, perfect, yet I could feel the shimmer of something behind it, faint, almost imperceptible, a presence waiting. The Keeper's lips moved, though no sound came. Instead, I felt the vibration in my chest again. Complete the cycle, maintain the watch, follow the rules. I understood now. The lights, the horn, the reflections, the Keeper. It was all a system, a cycle that could not stop. It had existed before me and would continue long after I was gone. My role wasn't just maintenance. It was participation, integration. I was now part of the rhythm of the island. I checked each control meticulously, adjusted the mirrors, calibrated the lenses, monitored the fuel lines. Every flick of a switch, every turn of a valve, every minor correction resonated through the fog, through the island, through the Keeper. The lights began to pulse in perfect unison, forming the lattice across the cliffs and water, exactly as it should be. Then the horn sounded low, deliberate, steady, vibrating in the floor, in the walls, in my chest. The Keeper remained still, watching, as if ensuring the cycle was complete. Hours passed. Time became meaningless. Daylight shifted, fog drifted, and yet the lattice of light persisted. The Keeper moved once, almost imperceptibly, then vanished, leaving me alone in the room. The lens continued to turn, the mirrors reflected, and the island hummed with a subtle, constant vibration. I sat down against the wall, exhausted, hands raw, lungs burning. But the pulse of the island, the Keeper's rhythm, filled me with clarity. I understood the rules, the patterns, the protocols. The Keeper was no longer a threat, nor was it a mystery. It was the system itself. I was now the system. As night approached again, the fog thickened. The main lighthouse, the east tower, and the north mirror light rotated in perfect harmony. The horn vibrated, calling softly, insistently. I followed the rhythm, moving from tower to tower, checking, adjusting, maintaining. The shadows in the fog shifted and danced, but none approached, none threatened. All were part of the balance. And I realized, with a chilling calm, that the island would continue, the cycle would persist, and I would remain the Keeper's apprentice, the maintainer of the lights, the enforcer of rules I had only begun to understand. The wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying the faint, metallic smell of the sea and rust. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the fog rolled in again, thick and silent, pressing against the lighthouses like a living entity. I adjusted the North Tower lens one final time and stepped back. The lattice of beams pulsed faintly, harmonizing with the hum of the horn. The Keeper's presence lingered in the air, unseen but acknowledged. And I knew this was the final watch I would ever take, not because it ended, but because it would never truly end. The island had its rules, and now, so did I.